I knew something was wrong the moment I smelled the dirt in my backyard, but by then, I had already signed away $230,000 for a house in Meadowbrook Springs, Arizona. My name is Gregory Thompson, and I work as a systems analyst for a semiconductor company in Phoenix. When I first toured the model home in this brand new development back in January 2024, everything seemed perfect. The houses were beautiful Spanish-style constructions with terracotta roofs. The landscaping was immaculate, and the HOA president, a woman named Brenda Kimmel, who seemed pleasant enough during the tour, assured everyone that this was a premium community built on thoroughly vetted land. The developer, Sunrise Valley Developments LLC, had plastered their marketing materials with phrases like pristine desert landscape and naturally beautiful terrain. I bought into it completely, closing on my property in March 2024. The smell hit me in late April, about 3 weeks after I moved in. It was not the typical desert smell of creosote and dust. This was chemical, acrid, and it got worse when the weather warmed up. My neighbor, Paul, a retired firefighter from Boston, mentioned it too. We were both standing in our driveways one Saturday morning when he walked over. "You smell that?" he asked, wrinkling his nose. "Yeah, I thought maybe it was just construction debris or something," I said. "Maybe they buried some trash during the build." "That's not trash," Paul said, his expression darkening. "I worked hazmat situations for 15 years. That smells like industrial solvent or something worse." I tried to brush it off, but Paul's words stuck with me. That evening, I noticed some of the plants I had just put in were already turning brown at the edges, and I had been watering them religiously. The grass in certain patches of my yard looked sickly despite the expensive irrigation system I had installed. By May, more homeowners were talking about it. Meadowbrook Springs had 215 occupied homes, with construction still ongoing on the final phase. The HOA held monthly meetings at the community center, a modest building near the main entrance. I had only attended one meeting before, back in March, which had been boring discussions about pool rules and trash pickup schedules. But the May meeting was different. The parking lot was packed. Inside, at least 80 people had crammed into a space meant for 50. Brenda Kimmel stood at the front, her perfectly highlighted blonde hair not moving as she shook her head at the growing noise. She was probably in her mid-50s, always dressed like she was heading to a country club luncheon, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that suggested she had been waiting her whole life to run an HOA. "Everyone, please, let's maintain order," Brenda said, rapping her gavel on the podium. "I understand there are concerns about odors in some yards, but we need to address this systematically." A woman in the front row stood up immediately. "Systematically? Brenda, my dog has been vomiting for 2 weeks. My kids have headaches. This is not just an odor issue." "I sympathize, Teresa, I really do," Brenda said, her voice taking on that condescending tone I would come to know well. "But we cannot jump to conclusions. The developer has assured me that all environmental assessments were completed before construction began." "Then why does my yard smell like a gas station?" someone shouted from the back. Brenda's mouth tightened. "I will be reaching out to Sunrise Valley Developments to request documentation of their environmental studies. In the meantime, I suggest everyone keep their windows closed and run air purifiers if needed." That answer satisfied no one. The meeting devolved into chaos with people shouting over each other. I left, feeling frustrated and uneasy. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the smell, about my plants dying, about that woman's dog getting sick. The next morning, Sunday, I decided to do some research. I went to the Maricopa County Recorder's Office website and started pulling up records on the land where Meadowbrook Springs was built. The property had previously been owned by something called Southwestern Chemical Manufacturing, which had operated on the site from 1987 to 2003. That was a red flag big enough to see from space. I spent hours going down internet rabbit holes, finding old news articles about Southwestern Chemical. They had manufactured industrial cleaning solvents and had been cited multiple times by the EPA for improper waste disposal. The company had gone bankrupt in 2003, and the property had sat vacant until 2019, when Sunrise Valley Developments purchased it at a foreclosure auction for an absurdly low price. My stomach dropped. We had all built our homes, our lives, on top of a former chemical plant. Monday morning, I called the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. After being transferred 4 times, I finally reached someone in the remediation department, a man named Carl who sounded perpetually tired. Southwestern Chemical, yeah, I remember that site, Carl said when I explained my situation. They had some contamination issues, lots of trichloroethylene and benzene in the soil. But I thought that got cleaned up. Cleaned up how? I asked. I would have to pull the file. Can you give me a few days? We've got thousands of old industrial sites in the database. I gave him my contact information and hung up feeling even worse. Trichloroethylene, benzene. I Googled both immediately. Carcinogens, linked to leukemia, liver damage, kidney problems. And we were living on top of it. That evening, I went to Paul's house. He answered the door in a Celtics t-shirt, beer in hand. "You look like hell," he said. "I think I know what the smell is," I said, and I told him everything I had found. Paul's face went from concerned to furious in about 30 seconds. "Jesus Christ, did the developer know?" "That's what I'm trying to find out," I said. "But there's no way they bought land that cheap without knowing its history." "We need to tell people," Paul said. "We need to call an emergency meeting." "Brenda's not going to like that," I said. "I don't give a damn what Brenda likes," Paul said. We spent the next 2 days going door to door, telling our neighbors what I had discovered. The reactions ranged from disbelief to panic to rage. By Wednesday evening, we had gathered enough support to demand an emergency HOA meeting. Brenda tried to shut it down, claiming we did not have proper notice, but when 75 people showed up at the community center anyway, she had no choice but to let it happen. This meeting was even more chaotic than the last. I presented everything I had found about Southwestern Chemical, projecting old newspaper articles onto the community center's screen with my laptop. People were shouting, some were crying, and Brenda kept banging her gavel uselessly. This is all speculation!" Brenda finally yelled over the noise. "You cannot just throw around accusations like this, Gregory. You're going to get sued for defamation." "Defamation," I said, my voice rising. "I'm showing people public records. This land was a chemical plant. That's a fact, Brenda, not speculation." "The developer provided all necessary documentation to the county," Brenda insisted. "If there were environmental problems, they would not have been allowed to build." "Then show us the documentation," Paul said, standing up. "Show us the environmental assessment reports. Show us the soil tests. If everything's fine, prove it." Brenda's face flushed. "I don't have to prove anything to you. The HOA board has reviewed all necessary materials." "Bullshit," someone shouted. "You've never seen those reports." The meeting ended with Brenda promising to request all environmental documentation from Sunrise Valley Developments and present it at the next monthly meeting. Nobody believed she would actually follow through, but at least it bought us time to figure out our next move. Carl from the DEQ called me back on Friday. "I pulled the file on Southwestern Chemical," he said, "and we've got a problem." My heart sank. "What kind of problem?" "The site was supposed to undergo full remediation before any new development," Carl said. "In 2004, a preliminary assessment found significant soil contamination. Trichloroethylene levels were through the roof, plus benzene, xylene, and some heavy metals. The property owner at the time, which was the bankruptcy trustee, was supposed to either clean it up or cap it properly. But there's no record of remediation ever being completed." "How's that possible?" I asked. "How did they get building permits?" "That's the thing," Carl said, and I could hear papers rustling on his end. "According to our records, Sunrise Valley submitted a Phase 2 environmental site assessment in 2020 that showed contamination levels below residential safety standards. Based on that report, the county issued building permits." "Can I see that report?" I asked. "It's public record. I can email you a copy," Carl said. "But Gregory, if what you're telling me is true, if people are smelling chemicals and plants are dying, that report might be fraudulent, and that's a serious crime." The report arrived in my inbox 20 minutes later. It was a 40-page document from a company called Desert Environmental Consulting, dated March 2020. I am not a scientist, but even I could tell something was off. The soil samples had been taken from only 5 locations across a 15-acre property. 5 locations. for a former chemical plant. The contamination levels reported were barely above zero, which seemed impossible given the site's history. I called Carl back. "This report seems incomplete," I said. "I was thinking the same thing," Carl said. "Standard protocol for a site like this would require sampling every 100 feet at minimum, especially with that contamination history. 5 samples is a joke." "What can we do?" I asked. "File a complaint with the DEQ," Carl said. "We can investigate, but it takes time. Months, maybe longer. In the meantime, you might want to hire your own environmental consultant to do independent testing." I brought this information to Paul, and we decided to pool money with some of the other concerned homeowners to hire an independent lab. We found a company out of Tucson called Arizona Environmental Solutions. They charged $5,000 to do comprehensive soil testing, which 30 of us split. They came out the following Tuesday with all their equipment and spent 6 hours taking samples from multiple yards throughout the community. While we waited for those results, I kept digging into Sunrise Valley Developments. The company was owned by a man named Richard Pemberton, a developer who had built subdivisions all over Arizona and Nevada. He had a reputation for cutting corners and maximizing profits, but nothing outright illegal that I could find. His attorney, I discovered, was named Marcus Webb, a Phoenix lawyer who specialized in real estate and had a history of suing people for defamation when they criticized his clients. That explained Brenda's threat. The monthly HOA meeting arrived in early June. The community center was packed again, standing room only. Brenda had 3 other board members with her, a timid man named Kenneth who never spoke, a woman named Susan who always agreed with whatever Brenda said, and a younger guy named David who at least seemed to have some independent thought. Brenda cleared her throat importantly. "I have been in communication with Sunrise Valley Developments regarding the concerns about environmental contamination. They have provided me with a copy of their Phase 2 environmental site assessment, which I am happy to share." She held up the same report Carl had sent me. Several people groaned. "That report is garbage," I said, standing up. "It only tests 5 locations on a 15-acre former chemical plant. That's not nearly enough to certify the land is safe." "Are you an environmental scientist, Gregory?" Brenda asked coldly. "No, but I talked to one," I said. "The Arizona DEQ agrees the report is insufficient." Brenda's expression flickered with something that might have been worry, but she recovered quickly. "The DEQ approved this land for development. If they had concerns, they would not have issued permits." "They approved it based on that fraudulent report," Paul said, standing up next to me. "We've hired our own lab to do proper testing. We'll have real results in about a week." Brenda's face went tight. "You did what?" "We exercised our right as property owners to test our own soil," I said. "Why does that bother you, Brenda?" "Because you're creating panic and destroying property values with your conspiracy theories," Brenda snapped. "Do you have any idea what this kind of hysteria does to a community?" "You know what destroys property values?" someone shouted from the back. "Building on toxic waste." The meeting spiraled from there. Brenda tried to maintain control, but eventually gave up and adjourned early. As people filed out, I noticed David, the younger board member, lingering near the exit. He caught my eye and nodded toward the parking lot. Outside, away from the crowd, David approached me. "I think Brenda's hiding something," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked. "She had a private meeting with someone from Sunrise Valley last month," David said. "I was not invited, but I saw them leaving together from her house. The guy was carrying a briefcase. After that meeting, Brenda suddenly got very defensive whenever anyone brought up the smell." "Do you think they paid her off?" Paul asked. David shrugged. "I don't know, but she's not acting like someone who wants to get to the truth. She's acting like someone protecting something." That revelation was troubling, but not surprising. Brenda had always been more concerned with appearance than substance. If Sunrise Valley had offered her money to keep quiet or downplay the problem, she would probably take it. The lab results came back on June 15th. I got the call from the lead technician, a woman named Dr. Rachel Chen, who asked if she could come by my house to discuss the findings in person. That was not a good sign. Dr. Chen arrived that evening with a thick folder. She was in her 40s, professional, and her expression was grim. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be direct," she said, sitting at my kitchen table. "Your community has a serious contamination problem. We found elevated levels of trichloroethylene, benzene, and several other volatile organic compounds in nearly every sample we took. Some readings were 50 times higher than EPA residential safety limits. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. 50 times? In some areas, yes, Dr. Chen said. The contamination is not uniform. Some yards are worse than others, probably depending on how the chemicals migrated through the soil over the years. But nowhere we tested was actually safe for residential use. Can it be cleaned up? I asked. Dr. Chen hesitated. Remediation is possible, but it's expensive. We're talking millions of dollars for a property this size. You would need to excavate contaminated soil, treat it or dispose of it properly, and then replace it with clean fill. It could take years. Who's responsible for paying for that? I asked, though I already knew the answer would not be good. Legally? That's complicated, Dr. Chen said. Typically it would be the property owner, which is technically all of you now. But if the developer knew about the contamination and built anyway, you might have grounds for a lawsuit. The problem is proving they knew. After Dr. Chen left, I sat in my kitchen staring at the report. Everything I had worked for, my entire savings, was now tied up in a toxic house. I could not sell it without disclosing the contamination, which would tank any sale. I was trapped. I called Paul, and we set up an emergency meeting at his house with the core group of homeowners who had been most active. About 20 people showed up. When I shared the lab results, the room went silent. Someone started crying. A man named Jeff, who had 2 young kids, looked like he might be sick. "We need to sue," Jeff said finally. "We need to sue the developer, sue the county, sue everyone who let this happen." "We will," I said. "But first we need more evidence. We need to prove Sunrise Valley knew about the contamination before they built." "How do we do that?" someone asked. "We find the original soil tests," Paul said. "The real ones. Because there's no way they bought this land without doing their own testing. They had to know." We spent the next few weeks trying to track down anyone who might have information. I submitted Freedom of Information requests to the county and the DEQ for all documents related to the site. I called Desert Environmental Consulting, the company that had produced the suspect Phase 2 report, but they refused to talk to me without a subpoena. I even tried to contact former employees of Southwestern Chemical, but most were elderly or dead. We were hitting dead ends everywhere until late June when I got a call from an unknown number. "Is this Gregory Thompson?" a male voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" I said. "My name is Michael Harris. I used to work for Desert Environmental Consulting," the man said. "I heard you've been asking questions about the Meadowbrook Springs site." My pulse quickened. "Yes, that's right. Do you know something about it?" There was a pause. "Can we meet in person? I don't want to talk about this over the phone." We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Tempe the next day. I brought Paul with me for backup. Michael Harris was in his early 30s, thin, nervous looking. He kept glancing around the coffee shop like he expected someone to be watching him. "I was a lab technician at Desert Environmental," Michael said once we sat down. "I ran the soil tests for the Meadowbrook Springs project in early 2020. "And?" I prompted. Michael pulled out a flash drive. The report that got submitted to the county was fake. Not the data itself, but what they included. We took samples from 30 different locations around the property. The contamination was everywhere. TCE levels were insane. Some samples came back at concentrations high enough to be classified as hazardous waste. My heart was pounding. Then why does the official report only show 5 samples with barely any contamination? Because the owner of Desert Environmental, a guy named Frank Delgado, cherry-picked the 5 cleanest samples and submitted only those, Michael said. He buried the rest of the data. I know because I was told to delete it from our database. "Did you?" I asked. Michael shook his head. "I kept a copy. I knew it was wrong. I thought about reporting it at the time, but I was scared of losing my job. But then I quit last year for unrelated reasons, and when I heard about people living on that site, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." "Do you have the complete data?" Paul asked. Michael slid the flash drive across the table. "Everything. All 30 sample locations, all the test results, photos, GPS coordinates, it's all there." I stared at the tiny piece of plastic like it was a bomb, because that is what it was. This was proof that Sunrise Valley Developments had knowingly built on contaminated land, that they had falsified environmental reports, and the 200 families had been defrauded and endangered. Why would they do this? I asked. Why not just clean up the contamination first? Because it would have cost more than the land was worth, Michael said. Proper remediation for a site that contaminated would have been $10, maybe $15 million. They bought the land for $2 million at auction. They were never going to spend more than the purchase price to clean it up. It was cheaper to fake the report and build anyway. That's criminal, Paul said. Yeah, it is, Michael agreed. That's why I'm here. We talked for another hour, getting every detail we could from Michael. He agreed to testify if it came to that, though he was clearly terrified of retaliation. When we left, I felt like I was carrying a nuclear weapon in my pocket. That evening, I made copies of everything on the flash drive and stored them in multiple locations. Then, I called a lawyer, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, who specialized in environmental law and class action suits. Her office was in downtown Phoenix, sleek and modern. We met the next morning. I laid out the entire situation, showing her Dr. Chen's report and then the data from Michael Harris. Jennifer studied everything carefully, her expression growing more intense as she read. This is massive, she finally said. If this data is authentic, and I believe it is, you have a slam-dunk case for fraud, negligent misrepresentation, and a bunch of other claims. You could sue for property damages, health impacts, remediation costs, everything. How long would a lawsuit take? I asked. Years, probably, Jennifer said. But you should also report this to the authorities immediately. This is not just a civil matter. Falsifying environmental reports is a federal crime. The EPA and the FBI need to know about this. Will that help us get our homes cleaned up faster? I asked. Maybe, Jennifer said. If the federal government gets involved, they can force emergency remediation and freeze the developer's assets to pay for it. But nothing in government happens quickly. I hired Jennifer that day. She agreed to represent all the homeowners as a class, which meant we could split the legal costs. Over the next week, she filed complaints with the EPA, the Arizona Attorney General's Office, and the FBI. She also sent a formal demand letter to Sunrise Valley Developments and Richard Pemberton personally, informing them we had evidence of fraud and giving them 30 days to respond. The response came much faster than that. 3 days later, I got a cease and desist letter from Marcus Webb, Richard Pemberton's attorney. It was 10 pages of legal threats, demanding I stop making false and defamatory statements about his client, and warning that I would be sued for millions if I continued. I forwarded it to Jennifer. She called me back laughing. This is a slap suit threat, she said. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. They're trying to intimidate you into silence. Don't worry about it. We have the evidence. They're screwed, and they know it. Things moved quickly after that. The EPA opened an investigation and sent inspectors to Meadowbrook Springs in mid-July. They took their own soil samples and confirmed our findings. Contamination was widespread and severe. The EPA issued an emergency order requiring Sunrise Valley Developments to stop all construction immediately and begin remediation plans. Richard Pemberton responded with a statement claiming he had relied on professional environmental consultants and had no knowledge of any contamination issues. He threw Desert Environmental Consulting under the bus, claiming they had provided fraudulent data. Frank Delgado, the owner of Desert Environmental, immediately hired his own lawyer and started pointing fingers back at Pemberton, claiming he had been pressured to manipulate the report. Meanwhile, life in Meadowbrook Springs was becoming increasingly difficult. The EPA's emergency order meant we were all living on a confirmed toxic waste site. Some families moved out immediately, abandoning their homes and mortgages. Those of us who stayed, either because we could not afford to leave or had nowhere to go, lived with constant anxiety. Were we being poisoned? Were our kids safe? The EPA said short-term exposure was probably not life-threatening, but nobody wanted to take chances. The HOA meetings became war zones. Brenda Kimmel kept insisting she had known nothing about any of this, that she had relied on the developer's assurances just like everyone else. But David, the board member, revealed at the July meeting that he had found records showing Sunrise Valley had paid the HOA $15,000 in community enhancement funds just before Brenda started defending them so aggressively. "What was that money for, Brenda?" David asked, standing at the podium while Brenda sat in the audience for once, no longer in control. "It was for landscaping and pool maintenance," Brenda said defensively. "That's completely normal." "Really? Because I've gone through all our financial records, and I cannot find any invoices matching that amount for landscaping or pool work," David said. "The money went into the general fund and then disappeared." The room erupted. People were screaming at Brenda, demanding answers. She got up and left, and we did not see her at another HOA meeting after that. Susan and Kenneth resigned from the board immediately. David became acting president by default. In August, the FBI raided Richard Pemberton's offices in Scottsdale. They also raided Desert Environmental Consulting and Frank Delgado's home. According to news reports, federal agents seized computers, files, and financial records. The investigation was expanding. Jennifer filed our class action lawsuit in federal court in late August. We were suing Sunrise Valley Developments, Richard Pemberton personally, Desert Environmental Consulting, Frank Delgado, and the engineering firm that had approved the subdivision plans. We sought damages for property devaluation, health impacts, emotional distress, and the full cost of environmental remediation. The defendants tried to get the case dismissed, arguing various technical reasons why we did not have standing or why they were not liable. The judge rejected every motion. Discovery began in September, which meant we could subpoena documents and depose witnesses under oath. Michael Harris, the lab tech who had saved the data, was our star witness. Jennifer had him give a deposition in October that lasted 7 hours. He explained in excruciating detail how Frank Delgado had ordered him to hide the contamination data, how Delgado had received payments from Sunrise Valley beyond the normal consulting fees, and how Delgado had explicitly told him that Richard Pemberton knew about the contamination and wanted it buried. That deposition was devastating for the defense. Marcus Webb tried to discredit Michael, suggesting he had fabricated the data or was lying for money, but Michael was unshakable. He had the files, the metadata showing when they were created, the GPS coordinates verified by the EPA's own testing. There was no way to dispute it. The case went to trial in February 2026. It was held in federal court in Phoenix, and the media coverage was intense. This had become a national story, the kind of environmental scandal that made headlines everywhere. 200 families poisoned by greedy developer was the general narrative, and it was accurate. I testified on the third day of trial. Jennifer walked me through everything, discovering the contamination, finding the historical records, hiring the independent lab, meeting Michael Harris. The defense attorney, Marcus Webb himself, tried to make me seem like a troublemaker who was exaggerating the danger for financial gain. "Isn't it true, Mr. Thompson, that you have no medical training and cannot actually prove anyone has been harmed by this alleged contamination?" Webb asked during cross-examination. "People's dogs have been getting sick," I said. "Kids have had headaches and nausea. Plants are dying. The EPA confirmed contamination levels 50 times higher than safe limits. I don't need medical training to know that's dangerous." "But you admit no one has actually been diagnosed with cancer or any serious illness directly linked to this property?" Webb pressed. "Not yet," I said. "Cancers from chemical exposure can take years to develop. Are you suggesting we should wait until people start dying before we do anything?" The jury looked uncomfortable. Webb moved on. Richard Pemberton testified in his own defense, claiming he had trusted his consultants and had no idea the environmental reports were fraudulent. He presented himself as another victim of Frank Delgado's deception, but Jennifer shredded him on cross-examination. "Mr. Pemberton, you purchased this property for $2 million at a foreclosure auction, correct?" Jennifer asked. "That's correct," Pemberton said. "And you're an experienced developer who has built dozens of subdivisions over a 30-year career, correct?" "Yes." "So you would know that purchasing a former industrial site at well below market value might indicate environmental problems, correct?" Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. "It was a good deal." "It was suspiciously cheap, was it not?" Jennifer pressed. "In fact, you had your own environmental consultant, separate from Desert Environmental, do a preliminary assessment before you even made the purchase, did you not?" Pemberton hesitated. "I may have had someone look at it." Jennifer pulled out a document. This is an invoice from Southwest Environmental Group, dated September 2019, for preliminary site assessment services rendered to Sunrise Valley Developments. The invoice is for $8,000. Do you recognize it? Pemberton's face went pale. I would have to review it. Let me save you the trouble, Jennifer said. Southwest Environmental Group's preliminary assessment, which I have right here, found significant contamination concerns and recommended comprehensive testing before any development. You ignored that recommendation and hired Desert Environmental to produce a cleaner report, did you not? No, Pemberton said, but his voice lacked conviction. Jennifer entered the Southwest Environmental Group report into evidence. It was a smoking gun. Pemberton had known there were contamination issues from the very beginning and had deliberately shopped for a consultant who would give him the results he wanted. Frank Delgado did not testify. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination because the FBI had filed criminal charges against him for falsifying federal documents and conspiracy to commit fraud. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On March 3, 2026, the jury returned a verdict in our favor on all counts. They awarded the homeowners $240 million in damages, $120 million for property devaluation and remediation costs, $80 million in punitive damages against Pemberton personally, and $40 million against Desert Environmental and its insurance carrier. It was one of the largest environmental fraud verdicts in Arizona history. But the legal battle was not over. Pemberton immediately filed for bankruptcy protection, trying to shield his personal assets. Jennifer fought that, arguing he had engaged in fraud and therefore should not be allowed to discharge the debt. The bankruptcy court agreed with us in April, meaning Pemberton would have to pay. Meanwhile, the criminal cases moved forward. Frank Delgado pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges in May and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison plus $5 million in fines. Richard Pemberton was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and violating federal environmental laws. His trial was scheduled for later in 2026, but his attorneys were negotiating a plea deal. And then there was Brenda Kimmel. The FBI had been investigating her as well, specifically those community enhancement funds she had received from Sunrise Valley. In June, she was charged with accepting bribes to conceal environmental hazards and obstruction of justice. She pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was strong. David had provided all the HOA financial records, and the FBI had found emails between Brenda and Pemberton's assistant discussing payments in exchange for Brenda's help managing community concerns. Brenda's trial was fast-tracked because the evidence was so straightforward. She was convicted in August 2026 and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison plus restitution. Watching her being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs was surreal. This woman who had acted so superior, who had banged her gavel and dismissed everyone's concerns, was now a convicted felon. The remediation of Meadowbrook Springs began in summer 2026 and was expected to take 2 years. The EPA had seized Sunrise Valley's remaining assets, including the undeveloped lots, and was using those funds plus the insurance settlement money to pay for cleanup. Contaminated soil was being excavated and hauled to a hazardous waste facility in Nevada. Clean fill was being trucked in to replace it. It was loud, disruptive, and inconvenient, but it was necessary. The EPA estimated the total cost would exceed $150 million, but at least it was being done properly. In the meantime, most of the homeowners, including me, had relocated temporarily. The settlement money had started flowing by September, and people were using it to rent apartments or houses elsewhere while the cleanup happened. Some families chose not to return at all, taking their settlement money and starting over somewhere else. I understood that impulse, but I decided to stay. This was my home, or at least it would be once it was safe. Paul and his wife decided to move back to Boston. We had become close friends through all of this, bonded by the shared trauma and the fight for justice. We had a farewell barbecue at a park in Tempe in October, just a small group of the core homeowners who had pushed hardest for accountability. "You did good, Gregory," Paul said, grilling burgers over a portable grill. "You didn't give up when everyone told you to. You saved this community." "We all did," I said. "I just made some phone calls." "You did a hell of a lot more than that," Paul said. "You went after a developer, the HOA, everyone who tried to cover this up. That takes guts. I thought about that conversation a lot over the following weeks. I had never considered myself particularly brave or confrontational. I was just a guy who worked in IT and wanted a nice house in the suburbs. But when I found out we had been lied to, that our health and our investments had been sacrificed for someone else's profit, I could not stay quiet. None of us could. By November 2026, Richard Pemberton had accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and environmental crimes in exchange for a reduced sentence of 8 years in federal prison and forfeiture of all his remaining assets. He would also be permanently barred from working in real estate development. His lawyer issued a statement saying Pemberton accepted responsibility for his actions and regretted the harm caused to the families of Meadowbrook Springs. I did not believe he was truly sorry. I think he was sorry he got caught. But at least he was going to prison, and that was something. Jennifer Martinez called me in December with news about the final settlement disbursements. After legal fees and remediation costs, each homeowner would receive approximately $800,000, plus their homes would be fully cleaned and restored to safe conditions. It was not perfect compensation for what we had been through, but it was substantial. "You should be proud," Jennifer said. "This case is going to change how environmental due diligence is done in Arizona. The state legislature is already drafting new laws requiring independent verification of soil testing for any development on former industrial sites." "That's good," I said. "At least something positive came from this mess." "More than something," Jennifer said. "You and your neighbors stood up to people who thought they could get away with poisoning you for profit. You won. That matters." I moved back into my house in Meadowbrook Springs in March 2027. The remediation was still ongoing in some parts of the community, but my neighborhood had been cleared. The EPA had certified my property as safe for residential use. My yard had 2 feet of fresh topsoil and new landscaping. Everything smelled clean, like normal desert earth. It felt strange being back. The community was quieter now, with only about half the original homeowners returning. The rest had sold their remediated homes or were renting them out. New families were moving in, people who got good deals on houses with documented clean soil and a very motivated HOA that was determined never to let anything like this happen again. David remained as HOA president. Under his leadership, the association had implemented new policies requiring transparency and homeowner input on all major decisions. The monthly meetings were still sometimes contentious, but in a normal way. Arguments about noise complaints and parking rules, not environmental disasters and criminal conspiracies. I ran into Michael Harris one more time in April 2027. He had been living in California but was back in Arizona visiting family. We met for coffee, the same shop in Tempe where he had first given me the flash drive with the evidence. "How's life been?" I asked him. "Complicated," Michael said. "I got a lot of heat from people in the environmental consulting industry. Some of them think I'm a whistleblower hero. Others think I'm a traitor who broke client confidentiality. It's been hard to find work." "I'm sorry," I said. "You did the right thing." "I know," Michael said, "but doing the right thing doesn't always make life easier. Still, I don't regret it. When I think about those families, about kids playing in contaminated yards, I know I had to speak up." "You saved lives," I said. "Whatever professional consequences you faced, you saved lives. That's worth more than any job." Michael smiled slightly. "Thanks. That helps." We talked for a while longer, and when we parted ways, I felt grateful that there were still people like Michael in the world, people who would risk their own comfort and security to do what was right. As I drove home through Phoenix's sprawling suburbs, past strip malls and housing developments that all looked vaguely similar, I thought about everything that had happened. 2 years ago, I'd been an ordinary guy buying his first house, excited about the future. Then I'd become an accidental activist, fighting corporations and criminals and a corrupt HOA president. I had learned about environmental law, toxic chemicals, federal investigations, and the slow grinding wheels of justice. I had also learned that ordinary people have more power than they think. When we organized, when we refused to accept lies and demanded accountability, we could win even against wealthy developers and their expensive lawyers. It had taken time and effort and money, but we had won. Meadowbrook Springs would never be the idyllic community the marketing brochures had promised. We all carried the psychological scars of discovering our homes were built on poison, of fighting for years just to be safe in our own yards. But we had survived. We had held the people responsible accountable, and we had created something better from the ashes of betrayal. My house looked good in the afternoon sun, the terracotta roof glowing warm and orange. The new plants in my yard were thriving, green and healthy in the clean soil. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, just looking at my home. It had been a long journey, but I was finally here, safe, vindicated, home. I got out of the car, walked to my front door, and unlocked it. Inside, everything was quiet and peaceful. I made myself coffee and sat on my back patio, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of pink and gold. The air smelled right now, clean and dry, without that chemical tang that had started this whole nightmare. Tomorrow, I would go back to work, back to my normal life of analyzing systems and writing code. But I would never forget what I had learned these past few years. I would never take for granted that people in positions of authority were telling the truth. I would never assume that just because something was legal, it was right. And I would never again stay silent when I saw something wrong. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the desert began its evening transformation, cooling rapidly as darkness fell. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. In a few months, the cleanup would be complete, and Meadowbrook Springs would be officially certified as a safe, healthy community. We would have won, completely and finally. But the victory was not just about the money or the clean soil or the people who went to prison. The real victory was that we had fought back. We had refused to be victims. And in doing so, we had proven that justice, though slow and difficult, was still possible. I finished my coffee and went inside, closing the door on another day in my hard-won home. The nightmare was over. The fight was finished. Life could finally, truly begin again.